Welcome to The Explainer. You know, when we think about 18th century naval history, our minds usually jump straight to these highly romanticized visions of grand galleons, daring captains, and epic, sweeping battles on the high seas. But today, well, we are looking at a much grimmer, decidedly unromantic reality. We're diving into a massive British naval crisis from 1740. We're going to examine the true story of Commodore George Anson's squadron. This was a fleet tasked with an ambitious amphibious invasion during wartime. But as you'll see, it descended into an absolute nightmare before it even weighed anchor.
To really wrap our heads around the sheer scale of this disaster, we have to look at the massive logistical nightmare facing the British Navy at the time. They were preparing for a notoriously long voyage and planned amphibious invasions. That meant each warship had to carry way more men than it was actually designed for. But there was one glaring problem. They had no men. Prime Minister Robert Walpole was practically in despair over this. At one meeting, he literally cried out, "Oh, seamen, seamen, seamen," warning everyone that a third of the Navy's ships were completely unusable just because they didn't have the crews to man them.
And the immediate lethal stakes of this crisis? Just absolutely staggering. While they were sitting around waiting for crewmen to somehow arrive, the few recruits they did manage to gather started falling terribly ill. First Lieutenant David Cheap, who was stationed on the squadron's flagship, the Centurion, logged some pretty horrifying numbers. We're talking at least 200 sick and more than 25 dead, and that is just on his ship alone, which leads us to a pretty staggering realization.
Here is the truly crazy part. This decimation, this immense loss of life and massive outbreak of disease, it wasn't the result of some surprise enemy attack. It happened before the ships even left the dock. On August 23, 1740, one officer actually wrote in his journal that, quote, "The battle before the battle was over." They were literally fighting for their lives against their own dire circumstances while still just anchored in the harbor. Section 1. A Fleet Without Men. The 1740 Manpower Crisis.
So this massive manpower shortage set off a disastrous chain of events, and it was really driven by sheer mathematical impossibility. Let's do the math. The Centurion typically held 400 people, but for this specific mission, it was expected to sail with 500. The Wager needed 250, which was nearly double its usual crew. But the Navy had completely exhausted its supply of volunteers, and unlike in later eras, Great Britain at this time had no military conscription. They needed hundreds upon hundreds of men, and the well had run completely dry.
Moving on to Section 2, the deadly ship's fever, an invisible enemy.
Stranded in port and totally desperate for bodies, the fleet ran headfirst into a catastrophic outbreak of an illness they called ship's fever. Now today, we know this devastating disease is typhus. But back then, nobody understood that this was a bacterial infection transmitted by lice and vermin. So as unwashed recruits were transported in boats, cramped tightly together in absolute filth, the men themselves became lethal vectors. Historical accounts from the time actually note that these packed bodies were more deadly than a cascade of cannonballs. Let that sink in. The symptoms were incredibly visceral and honestly just horrifying. Recruits suffered from heads that throbbed and limbs that felt like they'd been pummeled. In severe cases, they experienced bursting blood vessels and fever spiking all the way up to 106 degrees. Medical treatises from the time described the resulting delirium as men catching at imaginary objects in the air. They rushed the sick to a makeshift hospital in Gosport, but it got so completely overcrowded that they had to start lodging guys in surrounding taverns. And as you might guess, those taverns offered way more liquor than actual medicine.
Section 3. Kidnapped by press gangs. The violent solution.
Okay, so what do you do when volunteers are totally exhausted and disease is wiping out the few men you have? Well, the Navy resorted to a strategy that even the Admiralty themselves called more violent. We're talking about government-sanctioned kidnapping. Armed posses known as press gangs roamed the cities, creating just an atmosphere of absolute terror for local maritime workers. They'd look for telltale signs of a mariner, wide-kneed trousers, round hats, and crucially, fingers smeared with tar. They'd drag men hurriedly through the streets or even head out in boats to snatch guys off incoming merchant ships. The seized men were then thrown into the holds of small ships called tenders, and these were essentially floating jails, complete with gratings bolted over the hatchways and marines standing guard with muskets. No way out. But even amidst all this absolute brutality, there were these rare, amazing flashes of humanity. First Lieutenant Cheap became close to a young midshipman named John Campbell. Campbell had actually been serving on a merchant ship when it got invaded by a press gang. Seeing the gang hauling away this older man who was literally in tears, Campbell stepped right forward and offered himself up in his place. The head of the press gang accepted, apparently remarking that he'd much rather have a lad of spirit than a blubbering man. These acts of gallantry so struck Commodore Anson that he promoted Campbell to midshipman right away. But of course, for most guys, the press was just an outright tragedy.
The heartbreak back on shore was just immense. Family members would rush down to the departing tenders, hoping for just a glimpse of their kidnapped sons, husbands, or fathers. Samuel Pepys captured this devastation perfectly in his diary. He described women bewailing themselves, running to every parcel of men brought in and looking out after the ships by moonlight. He wrote that it grieved me to the heart to hear them. You can really feel the absolute despair in those words.
And for the men trapped on board, the despair was absolute. Anson actually purposefully ordered the squadron to moor far enough outside Portsmouth Harbor so that swimming to freedom was completely impossible. One trapped seaman, realizing he had zero hope of getting to shore, wrote this heartbreaking letter to his wife. He said he would give 100 guineas to get on shore, but instead, he just lays on the deck every night. He ends the letter with a final plea for her to do the best she can for the children until he returns. Just brutal.
Section 4. Drafting the disabled. Scraping the bottom of the barrel.
Unsurprisingly, the second these unwilling recruits and even the misgiving volunteers got a chance, they bolted. Countless sick men literally crawled away from the lax security of the Gosport Hospital. Over 240 men absconded, which forced the Navy to take truly unthinkable measures. The escalation of their desperation is just staggering when you look at it. They started with volunteers, right? Those quickly run out. Then they moved to pressing innocent seafarers. After that, local authorities used the opportunity to dump their undesirables onto the ships, thieves and prison birds that one admiral called the very filth of London, bringing all sorts of distempers with them. They even brought in 143 raw Marines who didn't even know how to fire a weapon. But the final step was scraping the absolute bottom of the barrel.
In peak, unbelievable desperation, the Navy rounded up 500 invalid soldiers from the Royal Hospital in Chelsea. Now, this was a pensioners' home for veterans who were old, lame, or infirm. We are talking about men in their 60s and 70s. Many of them were rheumatic, hard of hearing, partially blind, suffering from convulsions, or even missing limbs. These were men who had already given their youth and health to their country, and now they were being forced back onto warships. As Reverend Walter put it pretty bluntly, they were the most decrepit and miserable objects that could be collected. Nearly half of them actually slipped away on the march to Portsmouth. I mean, one guy literally hobbled away on a wooden leg. But those who couldn't escape were forced aboard. Lieutenant Cheap watched these incoming invalids, noting that many of them were so weak they had to be lifted onto the ships on stretchers. Their panicked faces betrayed what everyone secretly knew. They were basically sailing to their deaths.
Section 5. Setting sail to doom. A majestic departure.
So, after an entire year of delays, typhus outbreaks, mass desertions, and the cruel drafting of disabled veterans, the fleet finally catches a favorable breeze on September 18th. But the contrast of this departure is just jarring. As the ships finally started moving, some of the men were really elevated with hopes of growing immensely rich. They dreamed of capturing Spanish galleons and returning to Old England completely loaded down with the wealth of their enemies. But the grim physical reality was inescapable. Yes, they were sailing into the world anew, but they were doing it with a crew severely decimated by disease, padded out by elderly, disabled veterans, and unwilling, depressed prisoners of the press gangs.
And presiding over this whole wretched scene on the Centurion was First Lieutenant David Cheap. He stood up there on the quarterdeck in his cocked hat, holding a spyglass, just brimming with confidence, maybe even a little haughtiness. He listened to the splendid symphony of the ships gliding in elegant formation, yet, here is the kicker, Cheap himself was essentially on the run. He was fleeing from debts that made it impossible to find a bride, and running from squabbles with his brother over inheritance. On shore, Cheap seemed pretty doomed, but here, on the wooden world of the ship, he felt completely in control.
The fleet fired their guns 13 times in salute. It was a thunderous clopping that faded into the sky as they left the channel and were completely surrounded by the deep blue. But as we look back at the absolutely unimaginable state of this crew, we are left with one massive, looming question. These men barely survived the debt collectors, the violent press gangs, and the plague-ridden arbor. They endured the battle before the battle. But as they head toward the perilous waters of Cape Horn in an overloaded, diseased, and crippled fleet, will they possibly survive the sea? Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the history you think you know.